Hello, and welcome to this, our 59th live stream, No Space Like Home. One of the interesting things when you start talking about sacred space is the difference between space and place. We often say, no place like home. And oftentimes we treat it like it's space, but not place. There was a near where I lived in Illinois. There was a theme park, Six Flags. It's an amusement park for those who are not familiar with the chain. Well, one of the construction problems of this was the main site of the theme park was a long ways from the freeway, so they had to create an auxiliary road. Well, there were 6 homes in the way of that auxiliary road. So what they did was they eventually bought each one of these homes out. They kept increasing the money and the price and the offers. But one of the interesting things that resulted out of this was that they did a sort of a study of, it was more than just 6, but it was 6 in the directory, but they bought out like 20, 30 homes. But one of the things they did was they did a study after of what was the effects of the people who had actually lived there. And they found that after their homes were bought out, that there was a really, really high incidence of drug abuse, spousal breakup, domestic violence. There was just so many consequences. And what the researchers basically discovered was while their space was bought out, that these people now didn't have a place. And because they didn't have a place that was uniquely their own, they were dislodged. So when we talk about, like, for example, sacred space, we can't also divorce it from concepts of place either. This is one of the reasons why, for example, in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, you have more than one religion fighting over the Temple Mount. Is because it's not just space, it's place for all these various religions. It's a place that has significance. And it's not just holy space, but it's a holy place. So anyway, that's a little explanation of today's title. We are going to take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. One of the things, again, we will bring up is that super chats do have priority. We will take non-super chats as time and interest sees fit. If you had put a super chat earlier before the broadcast, we do go through the week and we do cut and paste those super chats, so none of them are lost, even though they fall off the live chat. We also ask that if you do a non-super chat, only post it once. We've gotten really sticky about this. We've already on today's live stream had somebody who's posted their question more than once, and they won't get answered today because of it. So we're really going to be sticklers of this. So if you post your question more than once, it will not get answered. Period. So also, if it has to do with a Bible verse or a foreign word, we ask that you give us a little context. So in the case of a Bible verse, give us the book, chapter, and verse. And if it has to do with a foreign word, tell us what you think it means and what language it's from. So just to give us a little context so we have something to go on. So with that said, let's start getting into the questions. Okay, we're going to start the night with 4 non-super chats, and then we're going to go to the super chats because we have got a lot of them tonight. So our first non-super chat comes from Jacob Testa, and he asks, also another question. What is the origin of dragon legends? Were they based off fossils, or is there another source of them? Okay. The whole thing about dragon legends goes way into prehistory. we do find small carvings from prehistoric sites that look reptilian, and anthropologists do call them dragons. So this does seem to be something that is in sort of the primordial, say, the prehistoric mind of men. Now, whether that comes from fossils or whether that comes from certain mythological constructions, we're not exactly sure. There were some excavations of Greek temples, for example, where they found these anomalies, which were fossils, essentially big dinosaur bones. And of course, they're sort of on the official reports, they might go and be put in the journal as an anomaly, but they never make it into the official reports because they're not contemporary with Greek culture. Well, it seems as though in some particular instances where large bones were found, that certain cultures did revere them as say, the bones of dragons. For example, in Greek culture, they were revered as the Hydra. This may have also been possibly the origin of say, primordial dragons such as Tiamat as well. Although we aren't exactly sure where, say, Mesopotamian, say, fossil deposits would have been. But it's possible they could have been moved around from site to site too. There was already, say, for example, in as early as, say, the 5th millennium BC, already some extensive trade that had been going on across the ancient Near East. So it's conceivable that they may have been imported for some reason. So we don't exactly know for sure where the legend of dragons came from. Augustine reports that dragons were known living outside of Carthage. Now we do know that Carthage, which is in modern Libya, has actually fairly not far from ancient Carthage were extensive fossil deposits. In fact, when I used to collect fossils and had a small collection, I had a couple fossils from that area. So I know there were Spinosaur fossils from there. There were trilobites. There was a variety of different fossils from that region. And in fact, there was one fossil dealer I knew from, say, Morocco, who used to get his fossils extensively from that area. So there's actually a large number of various sources that the dragon legend could have come from. And fossils is really just one possibility here. But no one knows for sure. No one knows for sure. So anyway, thank you for the question. It's an interesting question. Unfortunately, we are now sort of in that sort of speculative area of prehistory and anthropology. So thank you very much for the question. Okay, the second question comes from MJ, and he asks, what similarities did the Egyptian priests had to Levitical priests? Thank you. The main point of similarity is actually in their purification ritual. Both Levitical priests and Egyptian priests underwent ritual bathing prior to entering into holy space. In the case of Egyptian priests, they probably went a little further. They would also ritually shave and wash their mouth out with natron. But both sets of priests would ritually bathe, and then they would put on clean clothes. Okay? Not necessarily new garments, but clean garments. So both priests would undergo that sort of ritual of ritual bathing followed by clean clothes. And in both cases, they wore generally clothes that were made of, say, flax. In both cases, clothes made of, say, animal skins were not allowed. Because they were, in the case of the Levitical priests, the justification here would be, you're touching the skin of an animal, it's a dead animal, you're now ritually impure. So leave your leather jacket at home, essentially, if you're a Levitical priest. Likewise, Egyptian priests, they were, with the exception of the Sem priest, who wore a jaguar pelt, a leopard pelt as a badge of office. Egyptian priests were forbidden to wear animal products as clothing when they went into their temples. So that's sort of the lines of similarity there. So you basically boils down to three things: ritual bathing, putting on clean clothes, and don't wear animal products. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. Thank you very much for that interesting question. Now, there were a couple of exceptions here, even amongst Levitical priests. Like, for example, I think the high priest had a few wool garments he had to wear. But those were special and those were consecrated, and they were not the product of a dead animal. Okay, wool was considered to be an exception in some cases because the animal was alive when it was, sheared. You don't kill a sheep for the wool. So that's permitted. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the question. Faye of the Duat says, Natron tastes so bad. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it's so bad. Okay. Our third question from Corey Coogan. He asks, favorite OT backgrounds resource book, favorite NT backgrounds resource book, a little deeper than the layperson's introduction. Okay. I can't give you a real good background book for the New Testament since I don't really do a lot of New Testament work myself. There is one on the that is mentioned on the Gordon Conwell bibliography. There's a special center of let's see if I can. This is a great bibliography of, say, the best archaeology books. Let me go find this for you, just really quickly. It's the Gordon Conwell Center of Christianity. I will put the link up here. This has, say, the best books on. You want to go into resources. Research. I think it's research. Yes, into the research. And you'll see 4 categories: the historical Jesus, biblical archaeology, biblical studies, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, these have the sort of the best, the top of the line resources. Okay, so if you make it on this bibliography, you are a somebody. So there you go. Okay, I just put it on the live chat there. That'll give you great resources for the New Testament. Now, my favorite Old Testament background book resource is this one right here. Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament, edited by Jonathan Greer, John Hilber, and John Walton. It goes all through the Old Testament, various topics. It's beyond the basics. It's definitely beyond the basics. It's written for a college level, so it's a really good book. A really, really good book. Anything beyond that, you sort of start getting into really deep stuff. So that's a little deeper than the lay introduction. Now, I can recommend some books that go even deeper than that. But that's a good start. A really good start. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. Great question. Okay, now, the MRB. Any relation to Mr. Rich B.O.B.? And he asks, IP mentioned today, for you who don't know, Inspiring Philosophy released his third installment of the Exodus Rediscovered, which I helped him to produce, which was on the Conquest, and it was really well done. IP mentioned today that no pig bones are found in Avaris. True. Does it actually mean anything? Yes. Did the Egyptians eat pork? No. Even so, isn't no pork just a Semitic taboo? No. This is why it's significant. Because It's not a Semitic taboo. It's an Egyptian taboo. That's why this is interesting. The Israelites were not the only Semites. They're basically coming from a land of Semites, sojourning in Egypt, and then returning to a land filled with Semites. Now, not the Philistines, of course. The Philistines were Indo-Europeans, but the Canaanites were Semites too. And they ate pork. They loved their pork. Egyptians only rarely ate pork. Now, there's one group of people within Egypt that did eat pork, and those were worshippers of the god Seth. But that was kind of that was frowned on. That was really frowned on. Okay, raising pork polluted waterways. Egyptians didn't like that. So raising pork, eating pork, really frowned on in Egypt. So the significance here is this is not a Semitic taboo. This is an Egyptian taboo that the Israelites bring with them from Egypt into the Promised Land. That's what's significant here. And that's why this is so important. It's an Egyptian custom that they bring back. In a sense, or not in a sense, it is evidence that the Israelites were from Egypt. Because you go to, say, pre-conquest Canaanite culture, they're all eating pork. You go to the coastline where the Philistines are, they're all eating pork. It's only when the Israelites come in that the population stops eating pork. And where do they get this from? They get it from Egypt. That's the significance here. That's why this is important. So anyway, thank you for that question. It's a really interesting question, and it's a great question too. Okay. Let's get into the super chats. We got a lot of them tonight, so let's just dig right into them. First super chat comes from Pseudo Anubis for $10. Thank you very much for that super chat. Really appreciate it. You often say that most of the Torah likely dates back to the late Bronze Age. Are there any parts of the Torah that you believe can be argued to be seen as later additions? Oh, absolutely yes. Absolutely. There is actually a part of, I believe, Deuteronomy, and let me just look here. Let's see here. Okay. Deuteronomy 4, for example, now, where it says, starting verse 44, now this is the law which Moses set before the sons of Israel. These are the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out of Egypt across the Jordan in the valley opposite Beth Peor, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon, whom Moses and the sons of Israel defeated when they came out of Egypt. Okay. All those events, at least the latter half of those events, take place after the children of Israel crossed the Jordan. You're no longer at that point in the Exodus, you're in the conquest. This is after the death of Moses. So that part of Deuteronomy had to have been written after Moses. Likewise, his death scene at the end of the book of Deuteronomy also had to have been written after the death of Moses. Because Moses is dead. Okay? That had to be written after they crossed the Jordan already. So they're already in the Promised Land when that appendix is written to the book of Deuteronomy. There's also certain parts where it says, now these are the words that God spoke to Moses. And I think those also, those little sort of connecting pieces were also written, say, in the early Iron Age, possibly the early monarchy. Okay, I don't think most of what we see in the Pentateuch is later than the early monarchy. And the reason why I don't think that most of this is later than the early monarchy, is because we start seeing, in the prophets, and some of the prophets date to the 8th century BC. Those prophets are saying, did the Lord not lead the Israelites out of the land of Egypt with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm? Okay, well, that phrase is Torah. That comes out of Torah. So I can see portions of the Torah being written as late as, say, the 9th century, perhaps. The latest. Not the whole thing by any means. I mean, some of this stuff is definitely late Bronze Age. But some of the connecting passages, some of the explanation glosses that we see, those are, I would say, likely to be into either the conquest or the period of the judges or into the early period of the monarchy. But I think anything beyond, say the 9th century, I think you start getting into some problems. Because I think it's clear by, say, the 8th century that the prophets already know Torah. They're already quoting Torah. So I think that would be very, very deeply problematic to date it any later, those sections any later than that. So yeah, absolutely. There are actually some sections that are later than the Bronze Age. But I also think that the core documents are Bronze Age as well. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answers your question. It's an interesting question, and I think the composition of the Torah is a little more complex than, say, most evangelicals would realize, but it's also not as, say, not as secular, not as jaded as, say, liberal scholars would say. So I think there's a balance that's in between here that's reasonable. 20, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, our second super chat also comes from Pseudo Anubis. Thank you very much for that $10 super chat. In your view, who exactly was Balaam, son of Beyore, in the Book of Numbers? Okay, he was a prophet. Why was he unceremoniously killed off in the war with Midian? Because he was a very, very naughty boy. That's why he was killed. Okay, so who was Balaam, son of Beyore? Well, obviously he was the son of Beyore, but he was a prophet. And he was a prophet for hire. So he's the sort of prophet that you come to when you want to curse someone. You want to curse a nation? You want to curse a person? You want it because it was seen that prophets had ins with the gods. Okay? Now, this is very, very interesting because it's a view of prophets that's very, very different than what we see, for example, in Israel later on. In Israel later on, the prophet is seen as sort of the servant of the gods. The prophet is the servant. Before Israel came into the land, prophets were more seen like contractors. Independent contractors. Okay? You want to get in good with a god? You call an independent contractor. You want to fix your IT server? You call an independent contractor. The methods are surprisingly similar. The prophet does a little bit of magic. The IT guy does a little magic. Your enemy is cursed. Your server works. Everyone's happy. That's what he was. He was essentially an independent contractor. He would basically curse, bless for hire. That's what he was. Okay? And what he has hired to do was to he was hired to curse Israel. And the God which whom he had contact with refused to do it. Basically said, you gotta bless God. You gotta bless Israel. So anytime he was hired to do it, he would instead bless. He would go into his prophetic trance and then end up blessing Israel. to the extreme anger of those who had hired him. So, Balaam did something really naughty. And he said, okay, I can't curse this guy, these Israelites that you dislike. But what we can do is get them angry with their God. So lead them into sin. Send your women to seduce their men. Draw them into a trap. God's blessings will leave, and then you can do what you want. Okay? So Balaam, son of Beyore, set a stumbling block in the path of Israel so that they would be suffer from, say, curses and defeats and all that. So then when it came time to actually go to battle against the Israelites, and they prevail, they catch this independent contractor and then said, hey, you threw your lot with these guys. That's the end of you. Because he was a very naughty boy. Okay? So I hope that explains it. Thank you very much for the super chat. It also says, too, though, prophets aren't unaccountable either for their actions. That's the other thing. Prophets are just as accountable for their actions as everyone else. Just because you have an in with a God did not insulate you from judgment of the humankind. Okay, so thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Great question. Okay. Our next super chat. Our next super chat is from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. I recently started learning the Hebrew alphabet. Oh, good for you. But no vocabulary. Any new word you would suggest for today? Absolutely. I would suggest the word sus and susa. Sus is the word for horse. And what's great about this is that it has both feminine and masculine forms. So so you learning that word, you get to learn both the masculine and the feminine. So you have sus, a male horse, a susa, a mare, a susim, many male horses, or a male horse amongst a female herd of horses, or susot, which is a herd of mares. So that would be my Hebrew pick word of the day, sus. It's one of the first words you learn in Hebrew. It's a great, great little word. It also is the word from which we get the name Suzanne. Yes, Suzanne comes from the Hebrew word meaning horse. So there's your Hebrew word for the day. Best of luck learning Hebrew. It's a great language. It's an interesting language, and it's really, really helpful for reading the Bible. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, Brick Creation again for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Was the Roman Coliseum built from the remains of the Second Temple? And he's referring here to the Second Temple, in Jerusalem. All right, thank you very much for that super chat. Now, the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD by Vespasian. Now, one of the things we have to understand with the destruction of that temple is that the stones. Was this one of those partially yes, partially no answers? Okay, it was only indirectly built from the remains of the Second Temple. Now, the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Vespasian started the construction of the Roman Coliseum in 72 AD. He didn't take the building materials from Jerusalem to build the Coliseum. What he did was he took the precious items. It would have been prohibitively expensive to take the stones, so he left the stones behind. That was just rubble. But the serving implements, the gold gilding, the spoons, the holy spoons, the plates, those things. Those things were made from silver and gold. Those were precious. Rome was a particularly cash-strapped empire. So when Vespasian destroyed that temple, he takes those holy items, and every soldier in the Roman Empire gets a percentage of the booty. So he takes the holy stuff, he takes the precious stuff, goes back to Rome, and basically says, and they found this on an inscription at the Coliseum itself. There's a little inscription that was actually reconstructed at the Coliseum itself that basically said that this Coliseum was built from the share of the booty of the generals. So the Colosseum was built from the booty that had been owed to the top brass of the Roman army, the Roman legions that conquered Jerusalem. So, very, very interesting. It's a very interesting, it is directly tied. The building of the Colosseum in Rome is directly tied to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. But the materials itself weren't used. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Another one from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Is there any signs that Ramses II lost his army during 1265 BC? Is there any documented source about Ramses II's reign during that time? Okay. Sources at that point get rather scant. Now, we do have his records, his campaign records from Karnak. We have some limited records from Abu Simbel. We have it from the Ramesseum. His latest, the Exodus takes place in roughly the 25th regnal year. Okay, so 25 years into Ramses II's reign is when the Exodus takes place. His last campaign is in the 17th year. After that, he doesn't campaign. Now, there could be some reasons why he didn't campaign. Loss of the army could be one, at least of his chariot corps is one possibility here. Without a chariot corps, it would have been impossible for him to campaign effectively. Effectively. So we have to be, we don't know why he didn't campaign after the 17th year, but we know he didn't. We also know that around the same time, around the 25th year, 24th, 25th year, and the Egyptians also ratified their treaty with the Hittites. This also meant that they didn't really have to campaign afterwards. The Hittites promised not to contest any of Egyptian holdings south of the Orontes, and the Egyptians agreed not to go north of the Orontes either. So at that point, the Orontes was that line in that sort of that official line then between the Hittites in the north and the Egyptians in the south. So having struck that treaty, there was no more potential for conflicts anymore between the two nations. So there wasn't even a necessity for them to campaign at that point. But at that point, it's just like, well, without the need to campaign. But we do also know that, for example, the Egyptians start losing their holdings in Canaan already after that 1265, particularly amongst the Philistines. The Philistines start coming into the Levant down the coastal plain roughly around 1250. So already at that point, they're losing their holdings. It did not take long for the Egyptians to start losing their grasp. We have records of Philistine tribes in, say, the coastal plain at that point. So that's still during the reign of Ramses II. So they're already losing, say, their major corridor up into into Syria and into the Judean foothills. And after that, when Merneptah has to start defending the homeland, he starts having some real difficulties doing this because he just doesn't have the charioteers. The fathers are not passing down their chariots to their sons because they're lost. He's having to rebuild his chariot corps all from scratch. And it's not an easy task to do something like that. So anyway, that's pretty much all we know of that. But we can already see, for example, later after 1265, they're already losing holdings in the Levant to the Philistines. So at that point, yeah, if he had the chariots, he would have campaigned. I'm pretty sure of it. At least he would have sent a general to do it on his behalf, because that corridor is really important for that coastal plain corridor is really important for Egyptian access to Canaan. So I think that's very telling. That's very telling right there. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Brick Creation again for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. How would the 12 disciples have understood Matthew 10:23? Did they know that Jesus would be going to leave and come back during the time of the narrative? All right, let's pull that up and let's give that a read. Bible here. Awesome. Okay. Actually, we're going to take it to 22. All right. And starting at Matthew 10:22, we read, "And you will be hated by all on account of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. But whenever they persecute you in this city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become as his teacher, and the slave as his master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household?" Okay. Now, when they hear this, okay, they're going to hear that they are going to be persecuted and go from place to place. Now, essentially, he's basically telling them they're not going to run out of cities to flee to. Okay, this is basically a word of reassurance. You would get persecuted in one city, go flee to the next city. You get fleed in that city, you're persecuted in that city, go to another one. Add, rinse and repeat. And he's telling them that you're not going to run out of cities to flee to by the time the Son of Man comes. Okay? In a sense, he's essentially saying there's always another city. There's always another city. You will be persecuted. You will flee. It's just going to happen until the Son of Man comes. Now, whether or not they understood this as his resurrection or as his second coming is not exactly clear. Okay? And it's not even clear that this is referring to, say, just within the disciples' life. This could actually refer to just the church in general. Hey, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ. You're going to go from city to city. You're going to be persecuted. They're going to hate you. And, they're going to say nasty things about you. What? An unbeliever say nasty things about a Christian? That's never happened. But, so this is basically just, it really is, it's really not, the emphasis here is not whether they understood whether or not Jesus Christ was going to come make his return in the lifetime, or whether this is a statement about the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself, whether it's say in the short term or the long term. The emphasis here is really on the fleeing and the persecution. Okay, and it's basically just a evocative way of saying you're not going to run out of space to run. You're just going to keep running. You're just going to keep running. You're just going to keep being persecuted. That's just the life of being a disciple of Christ, is the life of persecution. Christianity is not a life for the timid. It's not an easy life. It's not a feel-good religion. You want a feel-good religion, go pick Buddhism. That's the one that'll give you the feel-good religion. And it'll disappoint you there too. Christianity does not promise an easy life. It promises suffering. And that's what basically Christ is telling him. You serve the master faithfully, you will have suffering. But you're also going to keep running. Okay? Because you're not above the master. You can only strive to be like the master. So it's hard to know what the disciples exactly understood here, but the emphasis on the text is on, say, the persecution, not on, say, the second coming itself, or even, say, the resurrection of Jesus. So it's hard to know how they exactly use this. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. It's a good question. Unfortunately, we can't read the minds of dead people. It'd be convenient if we could. Historians would love to be able to read the minds of dead people. And in some respect, we try, but we're not good at reading minds. God has not endowed us with those particular abilities yet. Thank you very much for the super chat, and great question. Very much appreciated. Okay. The next super chat is from Brick Creation for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hello, Dr. Falk. Cassius Dio records that when Nero was digging in his canal, many phantoms appeared. About 66, 67 AD in Greece. The Peloponnese, that's in the Peloponnese. Do you think that could be trusted? Alternate explanation, thoughts? And he continues, man shrank from it, however, when, this is a quote from that, when the first workers touched the earth, blood spouted from it, groans and bellowings were heard, and many phantoms appeared. Cassius Dio, Life of Nero, 6216. Okay. Kind of have to understand that Roman historians were not just, say, secular historians. They were also polemicists too. They were also polemicists. They did not always write unvarnished histories of, say, Roman emperors. So it like for example the life of the Roman emperors. I think it was it Suetonius. I think. I mean, it says some really unflattering things about, say, Caligula. But you do get this. You do get this where a Roman historian will Roman historians will dogpile on certain bad emperors like Nero. And this is just another thing where he's basically inferring here that Nero decided to dig a canal through a graveyard. That's essentially what he's inferring here. So he's digging a canal right through a graveyard. And of course, now you've got, say, the rhetorical flourishes that go with it. The blood spouting from the ground, phantoms appearing. I don't think that that's what actually happened there. But you might have had some workers, dig up some human bones. They dug up some human bones and started having bad dreams. So, at that point, the rest, gets transmitted by word of mouth over time. And you start seeing, some embellishments enter, say, some of the historical writings of, say, the Roman historians. Very common. Very common. It's very common for a Roman historian to add, say, moral embellishments to a history. Very, very common. So that's what I think happened here, is that Nero dug a canal through a graveyard. And the consequences of what happened as a result. Now, whether or not those consequences as described occurred is very doubtful here. But at the same time, too, your ancient person would have been of a mind frame to, if they had encountered, say, a bunch of human skeletons, they would have definitely not been happy campers. They would have probably had dreams, and they probably would have seen phantoms, and they probably would have reacted very, very poorly to that situation. We do actually, occasionally, we do get, say, archaeology students who, they go on a dig, and they encounter a skeleton for the first time. And they get bad dreams. They can't sleep. They never, especially say third-year students who've never done osteology. They've never done osteology. They go out on their dig practicum, and they start sweeping away dirt, and they're hoping to find gold. They're hoping to find gold, or a nice pot, or surprise! You get a skeleton, and they can't handle it. They can't handle it. Because now they have to clean it off, and they have to touch the skeleton. And some of them can't take it. Some of them, drop the program. Well, it still happens today. It still happens today. Where, and I have to admit, when I did my osteology section, you get basically what looks like a shoebox. They hand you a shoebox full of human bones, a full skeleton in a shoebox, and you pop the lid off the shoebox, and inside is a skeleton. This was once a person, and you have to pick up those bones, and you have to put them into order, in the right order. So you're handling a skeleton of some person who was alive, somebody who was dug up on an archaeological dig somewhere. Yeah, that's what happens to the skeletons in archaeological digs. They're put into shoeboxes, they go into university labs, and then they become training exercises for third-year students. Should they do the osteology section before going out on a dig? So, totally reasonable that Nero's workers would have flipped out. Absolutely totally reasonable. You dig a canal through a graveyard, yeah. His laborers would have completely flipped. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Great question. But that's what I think happened here, and I think it's not an unreasonable reaction from his workers. So anyway, thank you very much. Very much appreciated. Okay. Next super chat comes from Brick Creation again for $10. Thank you very much. Question, is out of them in Daniel 8:9 referring to out of one of the four horns or the wind's directions that another horn comes from? What does the Hebrew suggest in Daniel 8:8? Okay. Daniel, read it. Daniel 8. Start at verse 8. Okay. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and toward the beautiful land. Okay. Now, let's understand what's happening here in verse 8, and then we can get to verse 9. Okay, so you have this is prophetic literature. It tends to be written in a poetic form. So you have a male goat magnifying himself. As soon as he was mighty, as soon as he was great, the large horn was broken. and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous, the text implies horns, towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay? Essentially scattered the 4 winds of heaven. So you have in the image here is that you have a goat with 1 horn that was mighty. The horn's broken, and in a place came 4 horns that are spread to the winds. Okay? And then in verse 9, and out of one of them, this is the key passage here that you're out of the one, came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Okay. Now, the text here is a little bit ambiguous. The word here for one, highlight that, is ahad. The same word we find in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. But the one here is in the feminine. It's in the feminine. So, that gives us a little hint. Okay? There's just a small hint here that tells us that what to expect here. So we go and Hebrew here. Just hit the Greek by mistake. Lucky. So back to Daniel. Daniel 8. Okay, so we do have here, at the beginning of verse 9, we have the conjunction, particle conjunction, and we have the preposition min, so and from, and then we have the definite article, the one, and the one here is in the feminine. Yeah, it's a feminine singular absolute. So that tells us that what the one is referencing has to also be feminine. I'll get back to standard here. Okay, so understanding that the one is a feminine, we have to go back to, say, an antecedent. Now, there are 2 words in verse 8 that are feminine. Horn is feminine. The word karen, that's feminine. We also have winds, ruach. That's also feminine. This is where things get ambiguous. Okay? This is where things can be ambiguous. Because, strictly speaking, the one could be either the horn, one of the 4 horns, or one of the 4 winds. We're not exactly sure which. However, there's a little rule that basically says the last gendered item is probably the correct antecedent. So, in this particular case, it's more likely to be out of one of the 4 winds. Came forth a rather small horn. Okay? So, when we look at this, we have to this is where sort of exegetical training comes in. Because you've got 2 perfectly good feminine verbs or nouns that it could refer to, but only one's probably correct. And if you have to choose between one that's far away from the referent or one that's close, you pick the one that's close. So in this case, it would probably be out of one of the 4 winds came forth a rather small horn. And it actually makes more sense of the text too. Because out of one of the 4 horns came forth doesn't make a lot of sense to the text. You wouldn't expect another horn to come out of a horn. Although, in the previous verse, you got 1 horn split and 4 horns take their place. But in this particular case, it seems more reasonable that it out of one of the four winds came the small horn. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. It's things like this can get a little tricky, but I think that's the best explanation we have. And there might be some other exegetes that disagree here, and they might have their reasons, but those are my reasons for choosing winds here over for the four winds, one of the four winds instead of one of the four horns, in beginning of verse 9. So thank you very much for the question. It's a good question, really good question. Very much appreciate that. Okay. Our next super chat is from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, last question. Wow. You had like 6 questions tonight. That was a lot. Well, I very much appreciate the super chats, every one of them. I think I heard you say you were working on a video on eschatology. Well, we're thinking about doing a video on eschatology. We haven't actually planned it out yet. Will you be presenting views like futurism and preterism? Okay. My sort of modus operandi when I do something like this, especially a very controversial topic, is I try to present all views, or at least all, say, the major views. So I might do something on, say, futurism, preterism, full and partial preterism, amillennialism, etc. So, my personal leaning is towards futurism. Okay, but that's where I stand right now on it. I think that it's the one view that's best represented by the text. And you've heard my reasons already in many respects for why I don't buy preterism. So it will be on futurism, but it won't be your typical evangelical schlock either. I mean, the dispensational futurism doesn't do anything for me. I don't buy it for a moment. For me, dispensational futurism is as empty as preterism. So you're not going to get that either. It'll be something that you probably have not seen before, because I haven't seen it before. So it's like, okay. So when we do get something more in the bag on that, more concrete, we'll probably make some announcements ahead of time saying we're doing it. So keep your eyes out for it, and I'll let you know. Well, and anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, and thank you for that last question. Very much appreciated. Another super chat from the Camel Leopard for $10. Thank you very much for that super chat. Shalom, shalom. Well, Shabbat shalom. Those who subscribe to the teachings of a certain organization always claim that Genesis is the foundation of faith. I always thought it was Messiah. What are your thoughts? I always thought it was Messiah too. I'm funny that way. I always thought that the foundation of the faith was Jesus Christ. His incarnation, his sinless life, his crucifixion, his vicarious atonement, his death on a cross, and his resurrection, and his second coming. Oh, I'm sorry, I was corrected by my producer. I need a science degree in creation science, because that's the foundation. If I don't cast creation science, I go to hell. Okay. No, that's garbage. I mean, that is complete garbage. Yeah, it boils down to this. It's Christ's righteousness, not ours. It's not what you know, it's who you know. The foundation of the faith of Jesus Christ. Now, with that said, part of that foundation, one of the essentials of the Christian faith, is the fall of man. But The biblical text is very, very vague as what that means, as far as, say, the science of what happened during the fall of man. If you believe in a fall of man, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden ate the forbidden fruit, fell into sin, got thrown out of the garden, and sin became the perennial problem of the human race, you're good. That's all that essential requires. It does not require a wooden, literal American young earth creationist view of Genesis. It just doesn't require that. It never has required that. You go back into the church fathers, none of them require it. It's just crazy. I mean, it's just crazy talk. And if you don't have Christ, you've got nothing else. You know, and when you start elevating secondary issues up into, say, essentials of the faith, you're starting to warp it into a different gospel. And I think that's a danger. That's a danger because it misunderstands what the gospel is to begin with. But as long as you have that core understanding that mankind fell into sin, sin led to death, and that's the perennial problem of mankind. You know, how the science of that's up to then the conscience of the believer. And I'll leave it at that. 28, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And yes, the foundation of the faith is Messiah. Is Jesus Christ. Okay. Now we're on to the Twidgets. And I'm going to take this next one from Andrew Goulet for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. When Genesis 34:25 says that Simeon and Levi took their swords and killed every male in Shechem, do you take this to mean that it was just Simeon and Levi or their army too? Okay. No, it was probably most of the camp, most of the servants. Okay. Now let's bring up Genesis 34 because there is a really important detail here. Genesis 34. This has to do with the rape of Dinah. Okay. Genesis 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force. Raped her. And he was deeply attracted to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. This guy, swell guy. So Shechem spoke with his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this young woman for a wife." Now Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob kept silent until they came in. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. Now the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it. And the men were grieved, and they were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. And intermarry with us, give us your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourself. Thus you shall live with us, and the land shall be open before you. Live and trade in it, and acquire property in it. Okay, at this point already, Jacob is thinking, okay, this is an easy way to, say, enter into the land where I don't have to struggle with any other clans, any other tribes. But the passage goes on. And Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "If I find favor in your sight, then I will give whatever you say to me. Ask me so much bridal payment and gift, and I will give according to as you say, but give me the girl in marriage." But Jacob's sons answered Jacob and his father Hamor with deceit, and spoke because he had defiled Dinah's sister. and said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace for us. Only on this condition will we consent, if you become like us in every male, and in every male you be circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will live with you and become one people. But if you do not listen to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and go." Now their words seemed reasonable to Hamor and Shechem and Hamor's son, and the young man did not delay to do this thing, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Now he was more respected than all the household of his father. So Hamor and his son came to the gates of the city and spoke to the men, saying, now this is the interesting bit of this passage. "These men are friendly with us. Therefore, let them live in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. Only on this condition will the men consent to live with us, to become one people. That every man that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised." Verse 23. "Will not their livestock and their property, all their animals, be ours? Only let us consent with them, and they will live with us." Okay, so the men of Shechem had plotted treachery too. This wasn't only Simeon and Levi plotting treachery here. The Hivites had also plotted treachery. They were essentially going to, when the time was right, kill all the males off, all of the Jacob's men off, and take the daughters and the livestock. So that treachery went both ways here. The only thing is, Simeon and Levi got there first. This is something that happens in, say, clan cultures. Now, what you're seeing Simeon and Levi do here is clan justice. This is clan warfare. This is clan justice. In a clan society, and I'm going to cite a great reference here for this, which is Clinton Bailey's Bedouin Culture in the Bible. Okay? Very much recommend this book. Okay? When one clan rapes the daughter of another clan, it is customary in a clan culture for the offended clan to wipe out the entire clan, the entire offending clan. That is normal in clan culture. That's very normal. And it's meant to strike fear. It's essentially to create fear in other clans in the area. If it's seen that you are too weak to defend your females, you become a prey to every other clan, every other tribe that's wandering around. The thing about being a clan society is the strength of your clan is largely tied up in the perception of that strength. If other clans think you're weak, they will raid you. They will rape your daughters. They will murder your men. So, when a daughter of one clan is raped, the proper response in a clan society is to kill off the clan. That's just normal. And Simeon and Levi basically are reacting as if they're living in a clan culture, which they are. They are definitely living in that culture, and that is actually the normal response. So, in this case, they probably led the charge here. You know, the other brothers probably didn't come with, but the servants did. And they did probably kill off every male at Shechem. So, it's not that they had a large army. They probably had a few hundred men. But that's enough. That's enough to make a difference here. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, and I hope that brings some insight into the text as well. Thank you very much for that, Super Chat. It's a great question. Okay, our next one is also from Andrew Goulet for $10. And he says, what is the best resource for understanding the age of the patriarchs? I don't believe that Jacob was literally 70 years old when he married Rachel, etc. Okay, thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciate it. Do I think he was literally... Which book? Oh. Alright. Okay. Whether or not he was literally 70 years old, I think he... What we're talking about here is the lifespan of clans, honestly. I think we're talking about a clan of Jacob. I think we're talking about a clan of Isaac. I think we're talking about a clan of Abraham. And I think what we're seeing here is the intermediaries being excluded in favor of, say, one patriarch being given emphasis for the sake of the narrative. So, that's what I think is happening. That's why I think these ages are extended, is because they're being done that way for the sake of the narrative. Like, for example, you're going to read in say, Exodus 6, where, you go from say, the Israelites entering into Egypt till the time of Moses, and he's only got 3 ancestors prior. He's got his father, his great-grandfather, and is, basically, Kohath, which was already born before he entered into the land of Egypt. And each of those members is over 130 years old. So, there's clearly some intermediaries being removed at that point because people didn't live that long. Even back then. You might want to make a case that even if you accept the extended long ages of, say, people living, for example, in, antediluvian times, 900 years, we got lots of skeletons from Avaris. These were the people who became Israelites. We can tell from the skeletal remains, they didn't live into their 130s. They typically lived like the rest of us, maybe in their 60s, 70s. They certainly didn't live into the 130s. So, to try to claim that the ancestors of, say, Moses and the Levites were living into their 130s, there's a credibility gap there if you read that at face value. So, I would recommend, though, for a good resource on, say, understanding the age of the patriarchs, probably the best resource is, say, Richard Hetz's Ancient Israelite Religion. I don't think he talks about the ages of the patriarchs specifically, but that is probably the singular best resource on the age of the patriarchs itself. Other than that, I would recommend something more that deals with clans and clan politics, like Clinton Bailey's book that I answered in your previous super chat. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and it's a great question. Okay, next one is from Carlo for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Could one come up with a plausible naturalistic explanation for the extreme archaeological and biblical textual data behind the Exodus and Conquest? Oh, sure. Absolutely one could. In the case of, say, the stuff from Egypt, like the plagues, most of that is essentially hypernatural. Now, let's explain what we mean by natural, hypernatural, and supernatural. Okay? Now, natural, we all understand. That's the natural world. Supernatural is anything outside of the natural world, so the spirit world as such. Hypernatural is a sort of category in between. Hypernatural is something that is natural, but it's on the extreme edge of natural. So, like, for example, things that don't happen often but do happen in nature, like 100-pound hailstones. 100-pound hailstones do happen in nature. They are recorded events. They're rare. They're very, very rare. But they have been recorded. They are recorded as being bona fide meteorological events. Wind set-downs. Rare. But they do happen. They have been recorded in nature. And certainly, many of, say, what later sort of readers view as, say, supernatural events are really more hypernatural events. Now, it depends on which particular item you're talking about in specific. But, for example, the hailstones killing the army as they flee from the Israelites. Well, it's not a supernatural event. It's a hypernatural event. The river turning to blood. We do have a record from Egypt where that happened during, say, the Middle Kingdom. The early Middle Kingdom. Okay? It happened. It was rare. It's a hypernatural event. Swarms of flies. Oh yeah, flies are all over Egypt. There's nothing... I mean, that's totally natural. That's totally normal in Egypt. Swarms of flies? That's a hypernatural event. Crossing of the Red Sea. That was caused by... I mean, even the biblical text tells us that it was a wind from the east that parted the waters. Hypernatural event. Falling of the walls of Jericho. Another natural event, because frankly, mud brick casemate walls at a site that has severe wind erosion are going to collapse eventually. They are going to, mud brick and wind erosion don't mix. So yeah, the walls are going to fall eventually. So we do have to understand that a lot of these events have natural causes. Where God comes into this is the timing. Timing here is what's of interest. God is working through nature. God is working through these natural events to basically show you that he is involved in this world. But he's doing it through nature. He's doing it because frankly, Moses going out wandering in the desert and just happens to be there during a wind set down. Wow. That is... I wish I had that kind of luck. If I had that kind of luck, I'd be playing the lottery. I'd be playing the lottery. I'd be winning the lottery. Oh, man. Yeah, we'd be broadcasting from Jamaica. We'd be doing this from a beach in Jamaica. Yeah. 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 This is just. Yeah. There's a lot here that has say naturalistic components. But here's the thing: the skeptic even wants to deny that. The skeptic even wants to deny that. The skeptic wants it to be natural, but say then it didn't happen. Because he's overreading the text. Because he wants to overread the text. Because he wants to deny that God intervenes in time and space. And that's the core of our religion, is that God intervenes in time and space and through nature to do it. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Andrew Goulet again for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. In Josephus's Antiquities, he says that Abraham's son Keturah traveled with Hercules to Africa. Oh, well, that's another way of saying it, actually, but that's what I read. I read Heracles, but it's either one's fine. Does this mean that well-educated Jews believed in the existence of Gentile mythological heroes? There, in ancient times, Jewish historians, Jewish writers were just as impacted by their culture as we are by ours. Okay? And back in their days, their culture was awash with Greek and Roman myth. Yeah. Yeah, their Thor was better than ours. Ours kind of sucks. But, okay. Marvel commentary aside here. But yes, they would have known about Gentile mythology. They would have been awash in it. It was part of their culture. It was absolutely part of their culture. So if you understand that is part of their culture, then it makes sense that they would try to incorporate that. That's part of their worldview. That's part of their, lack of a better word, their truth. I hate using truth in that way, but that's what they knew and they thought and they believed. So Josephus, this doesn't surprise me. Now, this is one of the reasons also why I'm very, very cautious in using Josephus. There are 3 ancient historians I really, really hate. I hate Herodotus, I hate Plutarch, and I hate Josephus. And part of the reason I really hate those ancient historians is when they start delving into the ancient past, and this is where people tend to use them, is for things of the ancient past. Things that happened 1,000 years before they lived. They tend to embellish things a lot. And they tend to rely on mythology and hearsay. And it really gets strange really fast. Now, we know from the Bible that the sons of Keturah were sent eastward. They were sent eastward. They inhabited the region of Moab and Aram. So that's where they're going. They're going east. They may have gone south into even Edom, but they're sent eastward. They're not sent west, and they're not sent south. So, yeah, he's basically depending on a kind of mythology here to sort of fill in the blanks, and it's not really all that great. So I'm not a fan of Josephus whenever he talks about it. But well-educated Jews would have been well-versed in Greek mythology. So we happen to know this. This is no surprise, and very, very typical of the age. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Linguist Ambo for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you here tonight, friend. Excellent video with inspiring philosophy. Well, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Wanted to ask you what you think of the definition of harem, meaning to devote to destruction. Okay. It has more meanings than just harem. Now, that is one meaning. It can mean to destroy. It can mean to devote. In fact, that's sort of the strict meaning. You look at its Akkadian root, haramu. Haramu basically means to dedicate. It means to dedicate. And it's from that root Semitic word to dedicate that we get sort of two the word when it comes into West Semitic splits. It sort of bifurcates. It has two senses, two different senses. One sense is to devote to destruction or to devote to God. The other sense is and basically the other sense is like a harem, as in like a group of women that is separated and devoted to the king. Okay? Both those words, harem as in to destroy, and harem as in a harem of women, come from the same Semitic root, haramu. Okay? So, knowing this, the definition is a little more flexible and a little more pliable than, say, critics of the conquest would say, because it's the meaning to destroy is not inherent in the word harem. It's the devotion aspect of it, the separation aspect of it that is inherent to the meaning of harem. Destruction, devote to destruction, is a meaning that we have inferred from the text. So because we have inferred it from the text, we have to be very, very careful here that we don't confuse our inference with the meaning of the lexical meaning itself. So if you understand that, and then understand that Semitic words have a very wide semantic range, exceptionally wide semantic range. It can be devoted to a whole sorts of things. It can mean devote to a destruction. That is a possibility. Devote to separation. Cast them out. Drive them out. Can also be a meaning. You're devoting them to be separate from your population. Force them out. It can mean, say, isolate. Devote to it as in, you don't go in there. So you choke them out. You isolate them. So the meaning here is very, very broad. Very broad. It's but it specifically means to devote. That's the meaning of harem, to devote. And as I say, we know that from its cognates. We see the same sort of thing in the Ugaritic texts. We see this in the Akkadian texts. But we see, for example, say in the Akkadian text, we don't use it seen with destruction passages. We don't see it used with destruction passages in the Akkadian. But yet we do see it used as in to devote something. Like, for example, they would harem something for a temple sacrifice. So, same word, same meaning, same cognate, but it has a different connotation because it's used in a different context. And the context here, with that branch, we'll call them branch 1, branch 2. Branch 2, harem of women. Branch 1, devote to, a people group or a family or clan to say, possibly destruction or driving out. With branch 1 here, we have to take that within its context of, say, Joshua and the Judges, where that is then, as sort of a condign action. So, possibly, we can't rule out devote to destruction. We can't rule out necessarily devote to driving out. It's going to come down to context when we deal with branch 1. Branch 2, that one's more obvious. That one's easier to determine because, again, you got a whole bunch of women there surrounding the king. Okay, so I hope that answered the question. Thank you very much for that super chat. It's a very interesting question, and thank you very much. Okay, Gizbo SBOL for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. What script writing material would Moses have used? Okay, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the super chat. He would have probably used an alphabetic script. Alphabetic script was at least known since the early Bronze Age. We do, for example, at El Mara know that written scripts, alphabetic scripts, have been around since at least the 23rd century BC. Okay, that's long before Moses. That's like 1,000 years before Moses. So alphabetic scripts have a very, very long pedigree. They didn't originate in the Sinai, and they didn't originate in Egypt. They seem to have originated in Syria. At least that's our earliest attestation of it. Okay. Now, the writing material they would have used, they probably would have used a sharpened quill of some kind. They would have also probably have used parchment. Now, coming out of Egypt, we have to remember that they would have probably taken with them some rolls of papyrus. They would have also had some parchment already, because if we remember, one of the plagues, the cattle and the sheep get killed in the field. So they wouldn't have let that meat go to waste. They would have salted the meat. They would have tanned the skins. They would have probably, with the sheep, they would have made parchment. With the cattle, they would have made vellum. So they would have used those as leather and as writing materials. So in all likelihood, and as they would have wandered in the desert, they would still have their flocks of sheep, which they pastured as they wandered through the Sinai. So as they're wandering through the Sinai, they're going to eat sheep occasionally, and they're not going to let anything go to waste. They're not going to let anything go to waste. They're celebrating Passover once a year. So at least once a year, they're killing some sheep, and they're celebrating Passover. Those skins would have probably have been saved and retained for writing materials. So that said, they're going to probably be writing on parchment. They probably would have been writing using a carbon-based ink of some kind, charcoal. You can make ink, relatively easy if you've got, say, charcoal, some sort of binder, gum arabic maybe. They could have gotten that from traders as they passed through. So there's a lot of ways they could have made ink that would have worked just fine when they're out there. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Caramel Crunk for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Before I take that, I'll take this as well. Just, sorry about that. Okay, ancient Egypt and Bible. Actually, you got them backwards. Vellum is lamb, parchment is every other animal, chiefly kine. Okay, possibly. I possibly could have made a mistake there. It's been a long time since I've looked at the difference between parchment and vellum, so I usually only look at it as art material, so I don't usually go into that for a lot. But I do know that parchment does come from like adult sheep. Vellum I thought came from cattle, but if it comes from lamb, then I stand corrected. Okay, I'm not going to stand on that, so I'll stand corrected where I need correction. Okay. All right, let's go back to Caramel Crunk now. Okay, Caramel Crunk, good to see you tonight here. Thank you very much for that very generous super chat. Very much appreciated. Can you please find an Afrocentric video and do a popcorn review? Afrocentrists believe the Egyptians were black. Okay, well, we'll definitely consider it. Definitely. We're hoping to do more popcorn reviews. The fan base loves gladiatorial sports, and they do love the popcorn reviews. Now, we did pick the one that we're going to do for a specific reason, okay? But we're not opposed to doing stuff on Afrocentrism, on skepticism, on weird points of view. We did one once on ancient aliens until it got copyright struck. Then we had to take it down and completely, do the strangest popcorn review we've ever had to do. But it did introduce Mr. Empty Conjecture, so we are grateful for that. So yeah, absolutely. We will definitely consider if you have a suggestion for a good Afrocentrist video that you think would be appropriate. We do have criteria for this, though. Generally, the criteria for a popcorn review is that it has to be roughly 30 to 40 minutes long, and that's so we can cut it down. Because we don't want to use the entire video. Again, copyright. We also want it to be something where the person is unlikely to sue us over this. Like, for example, we'll never do like a video by Simka Yakovovich. Okay, we'll never do one of his. He absolutely deserves to be popcorn reviewed, but he also is a frivolous litigator. Okay, he'll sue anybody who criticizes him. So we're not gonna risk that. We don't have the deep enough pockets to defend against that. So we'll never do a Yakovovich popcorn review. It has to be something that's that has educational value. Something a channel we haven't done before. You know, some people have asked us to do other Myth Vision videos, but we've already done Myth Vision broadcasts, so we're not likely to do another Myth Vision broadcast. So there's we're just not going to we're not going to keep like hammering one specific person over and over again. That's not our style. That's not what we do. We do take selective videos to popcorn review because it's educational, because people can learn something out of it. We don't just do this for the giggles. There's got to be a point to it. So we are very, very selective about what we do. But with that said, however, Afrocentrism is definitely in the ballpark. It's definitely fair game. And if you can think of a good one that sort of meets our criteria, you can post it on Patreon, and you know, we will look at. And if not, you can just post it in the comments down at the bottom of this live stream, and we'll just take a look at it, because we do read all our comments. So anyway, hope that answered your question. Definitely will consider it. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and it's great to see you here tonight. Okay, Gizbo, SBOL, for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. If the Hyksos were fellow Semites, why were they set apart from and not able to eat with Joseph's brothers in Genesis 43:32? All right, let's read that passage, because there's a twist to this. Genesis 43:32. This up. Okay. And it says, 43:32. So they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews. That is loathsome to the Egyptians. Notice the wording here. Egyptians. Hyksos weren't Semites. Hyksos weren't Semites. But the Hyksos were not the only people at Avaris. And that's the catch here. That's the rub. Avaris was actually a multicultural city. It had Egyptians. It had Amorites. It had Nubians. It had Libyans. It had many, many ethnic groups inside of its confines. Okay? And because of the reach of the Hyksos dominion, which was essentially from the delta all the way down to the outskirts of Thebes, Egyptians were also part of their government and their infrastructure. Okay? So you did have, say, native Egyptians separating themselves out from the other Semites. So that's the reason, is what you're dealing with here in this passage aren't actually Hyksos. They're native Egyptians. They're the locals. The Hyksos themselves, they were Semites. They were Amorites. They had become somewhat Egyptianized, but they were never really regarded as true blood Egyptians. because the Egyptians saw them as a different ethnicity. So that's why these Egyptians didn't eat with Joseph and his brothers. And that was because they weren't Hyksos. The Hyksos were the rulers of Avaris. They were foreign rulers. They were Amoritic Semite rulers. But they're not an ethnicity themselves, and they were not seen as Egyptian. And the Egyptians never regarded them as being Egyptian. So that's what's going on here in that passage. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Great question, and that's the reason why. Okay, the MRB for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Sources on pre-Israel prophethood shamanism. That's a good question. Again, I'd probably go back to Richard. I mean, the best sort of as book again on early Israelite religion is going to be Richard Hess's book on ancient Israelite religion. That's going to be the best source. We don't actually have too much of independent sources about pre-Israelite religion. Most of what we know comes not from texts. It comes from archaeological remains. Now, in the case of Balaam, son of Beyore, we do actually have a text that's many hundred years later. There is an inscription that does talk about Balaam, son of Beyore, which is why we do think he is an historical figure. Because there is a text that does describe Balaam's son. That's extra biblical. It's an extra biblical text. Was it done on a stela or potsherd? I can't remember. But there's what's called the Balaam Inscription. It's called the Balaam Inscription, and it's Iron Age. It's Iron Age, so it's long. I think it's Iron Age 2, so it's long after the actual Balaam's son of Beyore. But it talks about Balaam's son of Beyore and that he was a prophet and he prophesied. So we don't have a lot of information that's say pre-Israel, not from texts anyway. Most of those texts did not survive. Presumably there were texts, some of them were written, but we just don't have a lot of them today. So anyway, a little disappointing, I know. We wish we had more, especially, as I said, especially written stuff. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I think we're starting to get to the end of the super chats, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, that's about it for the super chats, it looks like now. Okay, so we're now going to take some non-super chats, because we're out of super chats. So now on to the non-super chats. Okay. We're going to take this one from Kikwi, and he asks, are there any ancient words, names, idioms, etc. that are still in use today in modern English? There's one name in particular that comes from Egyptian that is still in use in English today. And in Hebrew, it's the name Mary. The name Mary comes from the Egyptian word Mary, which comes into Hebrew as Miriam, which comes into later as Mary, as in Christ's mother. And the name Mary comes from the Egyptian word meaning beloved, to love or beloved. So we do know that is an Egyptian word. That's an Egyptian word that comes into other languages as a name, including English. So anyway, there's one example. So most of the other Egyptian names, we do find some Egyptian names enter into, say, Hebrew, but generally not into English. Or we don't find a lot of Egyptian names that have entered into. But we do find, for example, like her. that's an Egyptian name that came into Hebrew. We don't find so much. English was never directly influenced by Egypt. So we shouldn't actually expect a lot of words and names to come in to English as a language. But there is that one, and it's a really important one. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. It's an interesting question. Okay. Question here. Fake warriors of the Most High here. Were pork-hating people only special to Avaris? No. Pork-hating people were all over Egypt. Egyptians did not like people who raised pork. As I said, pork fouls waterways. All you have to do is walk beside a pig farm, and the smell will just knock you over. There's nothing that smells worse than a pig farm. It is terrible. Absolutely awful. And pig farms pollute waterways. Now, you have to understand that in ancient Egypt, after the inundation, where the flood, all the land is flooded and covered with that silt, after the waters recede, water has to be sort of channeled in from the Nile through canals. And if you're the last guy on that canal, you want all the guys between you and the Nile practicing clean agricultural practices. You get one guy in that sort of who's sharing your canal, start putting a pig farm there, you at the end of the canal are going to be a very unhappy camper. That smell is just going to waft right down into your fields and into your produce, and it's going to be awful. So Egyptians really, really hated pig farmers. They universally, across the board, hated pig farmers. So it wasn't just special to Avaris. Hated them everywhere. They hated them everywhere. Okay. I'm going to take this here. Marcy Powell, do different words used for men in Leviticus 20:18, Ish and Zakar, have any bearing on how to interpret the verse? Now, I'm going to talk in vague generalities here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put the verse up, but I'm not going to read it. Exactly what this verse is. Because I do not want to run afoul of YouTube's community standards. Okay? And YouTube's community standards can be quite draconian. So I am not going to run. So I'm going to let you read that. It's at the line at the top. Okay. Everyone read the verse? Awesome. So now, it doesn't have a huge bearing on how we read the verse. But there is a slight nuance difference. Okay? The nuance difference here is Ish is a man. Ish, Isha, man and woman, basically husband and wife. Okay? There is the nuance here is that an Ish is like a married man. And then there's that sort of overtone here, is a man that could be married. A man who could be married. Okay? So you could say this is a man who's come into sexual maturity. It's a man who's come into sexual maturity. Now, a Zakar is a male. But it's a male of unspecified age. So that does have a slight nuance here. Okay? So, a Zakar can be a old man. It can be a young boy. It's just a male. So it's basically saying that somebody of sexual maturity, a man of sexual maturity, is forbidden from having sex with somebody of the male gender. So that's how we're going to have to interpret it based upon the vocabulary that's in the verse. So I hope I explained this. I hope I answered your question. I hope I didn't run afoul of YouTube's community standards. I wish to have my videos monetized for another day. Thank you. But again, I want your question to go answered as well. So I hope that answered your question. It is a good question. It's a worthwhile question to ask, and it does actually give us some nuance here. It does give us some nuance, and it does have an interpretive bearing. So it isn't just it is basically a man of sexual maturity lying with a male of any age. Okay? It's Zakir doesn't mean young man, doesn't have any other connotation other than it's male. Right? So thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. All right, and we just got a super chat from Sentinel Apologetics, so we will dart down there. All right. Sentinel Apologetics for $5 Australian. Well, thank you very much for that super chat. Good to see you tonight, Rob. I hope you're doing great. All right, and he says, Daddy Falk, I have finished my Mark commentary, now on Daniel. In regards to 1-1, any thoughts on the Babylonian armies at Carchemish and Pharaoh Necho? Oh yes, I have some very interesting thoughts on that. Let's see what Daniel 1-1 actually says here. Okay. Now, Daniel 1:1 says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Judah and besieged it. All right, this is talking about the conquest of Jerusalem in I believe it's 578. Or is it? No, it's 580. Sorry, 587. 586 BC. Now, Carchemish. Carchemish is what happened at Carchemish was you had basically Nebuchadnezzar's father. Nebuchadnezzar's father was still on the throne. And he, let's see here. I think is it Nabopolassar? I think it's Mary. Get that right here. Yeah, it's Nabopolassar. Okay, so Nabopolassar is on the throne, and he sends his son Nebuchadnezzar to go fight. And it's a coalition with the Persians. So the Babylonians and the Persians have this. The Medes and Persians have this coalition, and they're fighting the Assyrians. And you have the Syrians, they're you have Ashurbanipal II. He's the last king of the Assyrian Empire. And he calls in a favor. He calls in a favor from his good buddy Necho II, who he put his father, Necho I, on the throne. So Necho II owes him. So Ashurbanipal sends Necho a letter saying, hey, bring your armies. We need help. The Babylonians are coming. The Babylonians and the Medes are coming. So Necho decides to go up. He goes up. And he has him and Ashurbanipal join forces, essentially. And he's up there for a long time. This is not a short conflict. It's actually drawn out a bit, and some of this has to do with the fact that Nebuchadnezzar had to leave the battle early. So he finishes off basically the army of the Assyrians. They get crushed first. So Assyrians go in first. They get crushed by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, absolutely crushed. Then Nebuchadnezzar receives word that Nabopolassar has died. So Nebuchadnezzar has to run back to Babylon to secure his throne. At that point, the battle's over. Carchemish, the Battle of Carchemish is done. The Assyrians are done. Necho basically at the far end of, say, the conflict is basically, there's nothing here to fight for. Go back. And in going back, he sacks Jerusalem. He comes back down and Necho goes, like, I've lost too much here. Now, this was just a complete loss. This was a fiasco. So he decides to raid all the cities of Canaan, going back down to Egypt. So he gets a little bit of payback. He comes back down. He sacks Jerusalem. He puts a new king. He unthrones Josiah's successor, puts his own guy on the throne, and then goes back to Egypt. Okay. So that's sort of what's happening there. But once Nebuchadnezzar secures his throne, pretty much the whole Assyrian Empire is his. It's his at that point. There's nothing at that point to stop him. So Nebuchadnezzar II at that point, once he secures his throne from his father Nabopolassar, he just then he starts going on campaign. And essentially the whole Assyrian Empire is his. So Carchemish was a critical event. It was a pivotal event in the history of the ancient Near East. And it's one of the most important events that defined the Babylonian period and really the end of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians never arose again. That was it for them. They were done. So anyway, best of luck on your Daniel commentary. I'm sure it'll be excellent. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and I hope that answered your question. It's a really interesting piece of history. If you want to understand the siege of Jerusalem, if you want to understand the end of the Book of Kings when Josiah bites the bullet, if you want to understand why Nebuchadnezzar was able to so easily take the ancient Near East, you have to understand Carchemish. So it's a great question. It's a wonderful question. It's the absolute essential contextual material to understanding all that. So thank you very much for this super chat. Very much appreciate it, and it's great to see you here tonight, Rob. Okay. John Febeck for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Are there any clues in the text itself that the story of Joseph in Genesis that it took place in the Hyksos period? Yes, there are. Can we tell that the rulers there aren't native Egyptians? Okay. Not so much. No. There are a few things, okay? Now, first of all, the first clue is the use of chariots. We see there are two scenes in the Joseph narrative where Joseph rides a chariot. The first is when he rides beside Pharaoh in a chariot. The second is when he rides out to his brothers in a chariot. The chariot was introduced roughly around 1666 BC at the beginning of the Hyksos rule. Prior to the Hyksos rule, Egyptians didn't use chariots. And this coincides with other things too, such as the development of a horse that was suitable to pull a chariot. The native Egyptian horse was a wild horse. It really was very weak. It wasn't a draft animal. It couldn't pull a load. So it was when the Amorites brought breeding stock in from Syria, and they started to interbreed those horses with the Egyptian horse, that you started getting a horse that was suitable for pulling an Egyptian chariot. So we do see that development in skeletal remains at Avaris, where you just go from, say, Egyptian horse to, say, a more robust animal. We also see it in iconography too. So we do have that clue that the implementation of the chariot can happen no earlier than the Hyksos period. So we got that. So that's the first clue that we have, that this happened during the period of the Hyksos. The other clue is actually extra biblical, which is the beginning of the 18th dynasty, which is the end of the Hyksos period, where basically King Ahmose I conquers Avaris. That's the end of the period. At that point, the Hyksos are defeated. They're a defeated enemy. They're gone. They're wiped out. So those are kind of our bookends here. Got one bookend, the introduction of the chariot, beginning of the Hyksos period. The other bookend, the conquest of Avaris by Ahmose I, end of the Hyksos period. So Joseph had to be in there somewhere. Okay. Now we do have some other clues too. There's a statement in the book of Exodus. I think it's Exodus chapter here. Brief look here. Exodus 1. Verse 1 here. Sorry, chapter 1, verse 8. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's the other clue. Now, the clue here is that Joseph was a vizier. He was second in command over Egypt. To be second in command, that de facto means you are vizier. Essentially the prime minister over the country. And the names of viziers were kind of kept like the names of kings. And they were recorded for, throughout, say, a dynasty and a kingdom period, because legal documents were signed using the authority of the vizier. So it was important for Egypt's rather weighty bureaucracy that you knew who was the previous viziers, because a document could be still legally valid because it had been signed by a vizier of a previous reign. So it's very important for bureaucracy for the names of the viziers to be known and remembered. Now, for a king to arise that did not know about a vizier of the past meant that it was a kingdom or dynasty that the current dynasty and the current ruler doesn't recognize. So this is more than that just didn't know about Joseph. It was more that it was not recognized. There was no formal recognition of the legal documents of any Hyksos king by the new kingdom regime. So what we have here is a regime change. That's the other clue that's inside the text, is we have a regime change where the documents of past viziers are not being formally recognized. We know that, for example, from the biography of Ahmose, son of Abana, who was a general under King Ahmose. Yes, they have the same first name. That King Ahmose treated Avaris as if it were a foreign city, a foreign country, a foreign land. There was no way that King Ahmose was going to recognize any legal document written or ratified during the Hyksos reign. He was a new regime. He was an Egyptian king. He wasn't a foreign king. He wasn't an Amorite king. It has new regime, new power structure. His viziers would have authority, but not the viziers of those that were before him. Except maybe those that maybe have been vizier under, say, the 17th dynasty, because he would have formally recognized the 17th dynasty, but not the 15th dynasty, and the 15th dynasty is the Hyksos dynasty. So maybe viziers from the 15th or 16th dynasty, which were Theban dynasties, would have been recognized, but certainly not the viziers of the 15th or 14th dynasties. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, it's a little tricky, but here's sort of the clues that we get from the text itself, as well as the archaeology, that let us know that Joseph took place during the Hyksos period. So, thank you very much. A great question, and thank you for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Sentinel Apologetics, again, for $5. Thank Australian. Thank you very much for the super chat. It's actually hilarious from a bird's eye view. It looks like a tennis match between Egypt and Babylon back and forth, where Carchemish is on the top. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? There was this back and forth. I mean, you did have this sort of, Egyptians sort of holding back. You get the impression that, they did have, one of the things we do have recorded is that there were military exercises between the Assyrians and the Egyptians. It's a little bit like this. If we use, say, a World War II comparison, it's kind of like the Germans and the Italians. The Germans go and aid the Italians, and they find out the Italians are not very competent on the field. Well, the Egyptians go to Carchemish, and they sort of discover that the Assyrians are no longer competent on the battlefield. They do a few military exercises together, and they find the Egyptians aren't impressed. They're really not impressed. So they're taking the attitude at that point, well, we're going to hold back because we don't want to get killed. We don't want Assyrian incompetence to kill us. If they happen to show a little fortitude on the field, yeah, we'll come in and help. We'll come in and help at that point. But they're not impressed by what they see. So I think that's what's more going on there. It's a similar relationship between Egypt and Assyria that we kind of saw in World War II with Germany and Italy. So it is very entertaining, and it is hilarious to see sort of the internal politics of what happened there. But it is very, very interesting. So thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, let's go back to the non-super chats here. Righty. Thoughtful Potato. What are your thoughts on Bowen's Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament? I haven't read it. Honestly, I haven't read it. It's on my to-read list. I did eventually buy a copy of it, used, but I haven't actually read it yet. So it's on my to-do list. But I haven't been impressed with a lot of his arguments so far. I think there's a lot of very odd arguments that Bowen uses from time to time. Like his failed prophecy of Tyre is just really strange. No, he claims the failed prophecy that of Tyre, that it took 13 years to conquer. It didn't take 13 years to conquer Tyre, and and he goes, see, look, Bible fails. It didn't take 13 years to conquer. It was conquered by many groups. Well, you find out that that 13 years is actually from Josephus. It's not from the Bible at all. And it's like, oh, look, the moon's made of cheese. No, it's not made of cheese. You see, the Bible fails because the moon isn't made of cheese. Those sorts of arguments. It's like really sort of strange arguments. In fact, you look at the biblical text when it talks about Tyre, and it talks about that many nations will come against Tyre, which is exactly what happens. And yet we also have two cuneiform tablets, where the Babylonians are besieging Tyre. One where it says, one cuneiform tablet where it says, "Hey, I'm going I'm stocking up provisions to go against Tyre." And another cuneiform tablet goes, "Yeah, we've got this province now, Tyre." So, some of his arguments are, don't hold a lot of water. So, I'm not a great fan of his work, honestly. I think he should have stayed to Sumeria. Sumer was his forte. He should have stuck to that. But then again, that's just my opinion. I'm not gonna get into it with him on this. I'm at this point happy to let bygones be bygones, not antagonize him, and him not antagonize me. Although he has recently tried to put his toe over that line, so I haven't forgotten him, and I do watch him. And if he does cross the Rubicon on this, then the gloves are off again, and we're back to popcorn reviews. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it. Little Richard, the true king of rock, says, "What do you think of Seti?" Ooh. A very strange woman of dubious archaeological interest. Now, Seti, I forget what her real name was. She was a British citizen. She was a white woman. She got the impression, I don't know if it was through a psychic or a medium, or even a dream, I don't know, but she got the impression that she was the mother of King Seti I. She became fascinated with Egypt, and she ended up moving to Abydos and basically hanging out in the temple of Seti I. And she became a great popularizer of that temple. She would conduct tours, and she did this into like her 80s or 90s. She was part of that sort of spiritualist wave that sort of hit the British culture in the late 19th, early 20th century. So she was definitely part of that wave of spiritualism. As far as her, I don't know anybody who quotes her in academic presses. I don't know anyone who, she never published any, substantial research. She was a popularizer. She was essentially a popularizer. So, as I said, I've never even run across a single publication that she wrote. So she might have a publication, I don't know, but I've never run across one. And I've quoted a lot of stuff from the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. So, it's for me, that's a very important temple. But even so, never used any of her work. Never found any value in it. I know there was a biography written about her. I've never read it. Never read it. So, as far as modern Egyptology goes, she's a curiosity, but she isn't an important figure. So, at least not as a scholarly figure, anyway. So, anyway, thank you for the question. It's an interesting question, and she's she's an odd duck. She's an odd duck. I do know somebody who's met Seti. His comment was that she was strange. So, I will just leave it at that. Thank you for the question. Very much appreciate the question. Someone the person asks, what was the main casus belli for Egyptians in most conquests for the purpose of making vassal states to give tribute? Tribute. It wasn't about empire. Okay. Egypt only conquered areas that were close to home. Nubia and basically Canaan. The reason why was to collect tribute. They weren't interested in governments. Okay? They weren't setting up empires. They didn't sort of put their administrators, they didn't take out the old kings and put in their kings. They didn't do that. They didn't burn down cities. They kept all that stuff intact. And that's because what they wanted was to collect tribute. And the reason they collected tribute was to prop up a staggering amount of inflation in the Egyptian economy. The Egyptian economy had survived for 3,000 years. It had an amazing amount of inflation. In fact, Wolfgang Helck did a series of books on the price of goods in Egypt, and you can just see it just skyrocket. From, say, the Old Kingdom, pre-Khufu, all the way to, say, Third Intermediate Period. It's just, prices are just going through the roof, doubling, tripling, quadrupling. So one of the ways that they hedged inflation was to have these vassal states to essentially bring in more goods, more precious metals to reduce the price of goods at home. So they needed these hegemonies to prop up their economy. And you could really see that when they lost those hegemonies, inflation went through the roof. This is what happened. This is how the reign of Ramses III ended. Was they started losing tribute, and inflation skyrockets, and it gets so bad that he gets assassinated over it. So, yeah, and his successor, Ramses IV, is no better at managing the inflation. It's just something that they cannot control at that point. So that's the reason. They weren't interested in ruling. They didn't want to rule. They knew empire was expensive. Anything that was expensive, the Egyptians didn't want to do. So they weren't like Assyrians. They weren't like Babylonians. They weren't there to rule. They didn't want the cost. They wanted the tribute because they were propping up an economy, not an empire. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. Okay. Okay, the Anabaptist asks, why were the Egyptians unable or unwilling to stop the Philistines' conquest of the coastal plain as well as the Israelite context? What effect did these events have on Egypt? Okay. Now, we're never really told. The Egyptians don't tell us why they couldn't stop the Philistine conquest, but they couldn't, and they didn't. Now, the Philistine conquest happens around 1250 BC. The Israelite Exodus is around 1265 BC. If you put the pieces together, you can kind of figure out why they weren't able to stop the Philistines. And I think my conclusion here is that the Egyptians lost their chariots, at least 3/4 of their chariots. They still had a division of chariots in Libya, but that's not enough to do with conquest. So they lost 3/4 of the chariots in the Red Sea. And at that point, they could defend their borders somewhat, but at that point, they couldn't really go on conquest. They couldn't retake those Philistine cities or drive out the Philistines, or at least assert control over the Philistines. Now, we do have one campaign during Merneptah where he goes, he does a campaign through the land of Philistines, but by that point, it's a fait accompli. Philistines already have the coastal plain at that point. There's nothing really Merneptah can do except to make those Philistine towns vassals. That's about it. That's all he can do at that point. So what effect did this have on Egypt? Well, first of all, it did provide a choking hold. The Egyptians depended on that corridor up the coastal plain of Canaan to get into, say, Syria, the Jezreel Valley, and into the Judean foothills. So, if the Egyptians weren't able to fend off the Philistines, who came in from the north and conquered the Canaanite city-states in the coastal plain, they certainly were not able to defend against a group coming in from east of the Jordan into the Judean foothills. So, the ultimate effect that this had on Egypt is it sort of cut off Egypt's ties to Canaan. It caused there's some instability in succession. Like, for example, after Merneptah, you had a couple of coups and a succession crisis. Then you had a change in dynasty because of another coup. And then total economic collapse. And this is where we start seeing, say, the Bronze Age collapse come in. So about 40 years after the Exodus period, you get essentially the beginnings of that Bronze Age collapse. And that Bronze Age collapse, that's happening around, the beginning at the reign of Merneptah and into the next several years. And Egypt is, at that point, can't retake Canaan. In fact, the last sort of conquest we have one scarab from Ramses VI in Canaan, but it doesn't seem like it was much of a campaign. The last major campaign that was done by Ramses IV, and it's a really minor campaign. It only goes up the coastal plain back. So the last sort of prior to, say, the Third Intermediate period with, say, King Shoshank and Solomon as such, or not Solomon, but Rehoboam, is the last campaign up is Merneptah's. And he just he goes up the coastal plain into the Jezreel Valley and down a little bit into the Judean foothills, but really not very far. So he doesn't get very far into the Judean foothills, but just enough that he encounters at least some of the Israelites. So that's sort of what happens here. That's sort of the events that take place that sort of, defines what sort of happens here. It sets the stage. And the question is, which is the cause effect? Okay. Did the Philistines cause, was it the Philistine invasion that allowed Israel to settle? Or was it the Exodus and the event at the Reed Sea that allowed the Philistines to conquer the coastal plain? And I think it's the latter. That really the destruction of the chariots provided the opportunity the Philistines needed to conquer the coastal plain, and that in turn provided the opportunity for the Israelites to conquer the Judean foothills. One thing leads to the other. It's a series of events. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. Muhammad Quran, who do you think is the smaller horn of Daniel 8? I think the smaller horn is the Antichrist. Okay? And the reason is because the small horn is identified in the Book of Revelation as the Antichrist. Now, the Book of Revelation is basically an attempt to explain the symbolism of all the apocalyptic and prophetic literature of the Old Testament. So, that's basically where that's my interpretation of the smaller horn. Is I'm basing it on, say, Revelation. Let me see if I can find the exact passage here. I believe it's Revelation 17. Find it will have. But can't seem to find the reference right. But okay, so but anyway, that's I can't seem to find the reference right now. But anyway, that's what I think the small horn is. I think that's a reference to the Antichrist. So again, it's based upon the Book of Revelation. So, but not much of an answer. I wish I could have had the scriptural support here for this, but I'll have to look into this deeper. Again, we haven't actually gone into this in great depth yet, and we're going to be doing a series probably on, say, eschatology and the Book of Revelation. And in there we'll probably discuss this in a lot more detail. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and that's my opinion. Probably not that educated an opinion, but it's my opinion at the moment. So thank you very much for the question. Okay, Vic M, another super chat for $13.99 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you know if there are plans to speed up publication of the remaining Oxyrhyncha papyri by using machine learning methods to read and decipher the papyri? Actually, they're not. In fact, if anything, their efforts have slowed down a lot. Here's the reason: they've run out of money. I hate to say this. The unfortunate truth of research is it depends on cash. Yeah, there was a philosopher by the name, I think his name was David Stove. Was it David Stove? Yeah, it was David Stove. He's an Australian philosopher. And he says, for there to be learning and advancement of knowledge, there has to be leisure. Now, this rubs people the wrong way, but hear it out. Hear this out. if you have to go work a field for 18 hours, 16 hours a day, cook, clean, all that stuff, just the things of facts, the things of life, and you're toiling hard labor, even pulling a 9-to-5 job, you don't have free time. The one thing research requires is free time. Somebody has to pay the cost where you are not where you're not working a field or not doing a 9-to-5 job, that you're dedicating your time doing research. That takes money because the guy still has to eat. He still has to eat. Your researchers have to eat. They have to live. They have to pay their rent. They have to be clothed. They have to pay for their electricity. They have to pay for the plumbing when it breaks. It's costly. It's costly to support somebody to do research. And this is one of the things why I'm get a little uptight about, say, fully tenured professors that, get, hate rich people. They hate rich people. Well, rich people fund universities. They fund the universities that allow these people to not work 9-to-5 jobs so they can do research. It's a sign of ingratitude. It's a really great sign of ingratitude. I was funded by a rich person when I did my PhD. I'm grateful. I'm very, very grateful that I had that opportunity. What's happened for the research project at Oxyrhynchus is they've run out of money. So they now have basically grad students. Grad students are now the only people who are still working on the Oxyrhynchus papyri. They've got lots of papyri. Now, they have been able to sort out the ones that are biblical texts already. So there's probably no more biblical texts coming out there. These are just more or less civil documents, contracts, poems, pieces of poems, fragmentary texts. And there's about 2 million left. Okay. But as sort of the biblical texts were published, and sort of the key larger texts were published from Oxyrhynchus, interest has faded. Donors have gone away. They're out of cash. So I don't think that even if they had the access to the machine learning to read and decipher papyri, and really that takes a special eye. That's something only a human can do. They just don't have the money to do it. Put simply, they're out of the cash. So unless you get like a fully funded share that's doing it, I don't think we're going to see it's gotten so slow. The publication efforts have gotten so slow now. They're now like publishing in a volume like every 10-15 years now. It's really slow. The publishing efforts on Oxyrhynchus are now exceptionally slow. And again, it comes down to lack of interest, lack of cash. So, I hate to say it, but David Stove is right. If you don't have the money, you can't get the research done. And the team that did the Oxyrhynchus stuff just doesn't have the cash anymore. So, sorry, sad. I'd like to see more of these published. I mean, they are valuable volumes. But they're they're now at the point of diminishing returns. Lesser important texts, I think they should be published, but they're lesser important texts and they're not garnering the interests. So, unfortunately, very disappointing. It's very, very disappointing. I'd like to have seen better. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I wish I had better news for you here. All right? Thank you so much. Okay, I'll take a couple more super chats. Let's start. Fifth C. Is Francesca Stavrokopoulou a respected scholar in Old Testament studies? Depends who you ask. Liberals love her. Atheists love her. Moderate scholars think she's for fringe. Okay. I think she's out in left field. Okay. So respect is going to depend on who you ask. Her program's not highly regarded. She has some very strange views. Very, very strange views. Such as the dedication of the firstborn she thinks is child sacrifice. And I don't think the text supports that in any way. She thinks that Yahweh, in the minds of the ancient peoples, was conceived to have had a physical body. Again, yeah, that's kind of there's some doubt there. Yeah, she's got some strange views. She's got some very strange views, and we might popcorn review her at some point, but I haven't chosen any material yet that would be appropriate. So we'll see. We'll see about that. But anyway, again, respect is going to depend on who you ask. She's certainly not respected in conservative circles, and even moderate circles kind of raise an eyebrow. Liberal and atheists love her. So again, it's going to sometimes this sort of respect spectrum is basically going to come down to, well, is her research thorough? Is it well supported? And does it agree with other scholars in the field? Agreement is a large part of this. And I don't think she's that thorough. I don't think she's that good. And she certainly doesn't agree with the other scholars that I do say more respect. So that's what I think. And again, you ask liberal scholars, they'll love her. BBC loves her. BBC loves her. That wouldn't have anything at all to do with, say, her physique. I'm just saying. Okay. So, take another question here. Muslim Stalinist asks, how come the Exodus tradition doesn't mention the Temple of Baal at Avaris? Very interesting question. The Exodus tradition doesn't mention the Temple of Baal because it doesn't want its people worshipping Baal. Now, we do know that amongst those who came in the Exodus, that some of them were priests. And priests that had probably served at the Temple of Baal. That's really the only Semitic temple there. We do know actually a fair bit about that temple. That temple has been excavated. It dates to no earlier than Dynasty 15. So it's a Dynasty 15 temple. So it's a Hyksos temple. We do know that the Hyksos kings worshipped Baal. So we can presume that all the Semites that lived in Avaris also worshipped Baal, because the Temple of Baal is in the Semitic district. Okay? But the fact it doesn't mention the Temple of Baal or Baal himself is telling. It's essentially a form of damnatio memoriae, the damned of memory. So they're trying to wipe out the memory of Baal, because Baal's going to be in Canaan. That's where the Israelites are going. The last thing they want to do is sort of remind the Israelites, hey, this is where you came from. So if you tell them that, hey, you're Baal worshippers, there's going to be some people in your population that go, Baal, Yahweh, same thing. And that's the thing they want to avoid. That's what Moses, Aaron, and Yahweh want to avoid, is them going back to Baal. Now, when they get into Canaan, yeah, they're going to go back to Baal. They're going to go back to Baal on wholesale. But you don't have to add gasoline to that fire either. So that's why I don't think they mention it. But it is very, very clear. Like, for example, Korah was a priest at Avaris. He was a priest. He was never a Levitical priest. He was never a descendant of Aaron. Yet he was a priest. You can even tell by the name. Korah means bald, so he's clean shaven. He burns incense, so he's doing the practices of the priest. And the whole Korah rebellion is over who can be a priest. Line of Aaron, or anyone who was a priest in the past. That whole rebellion is over that, over who had served in the Temple of Baal versus who was going to be able to serve in Yahweh's new religion. And it's clear that when they were at Avaris, that's who they were serving. Primarily Baal. We also have some indication too that they served other deities too, like Resheph and Astarte as well, but Baal was the big figure at Avaris. The big figure. In fact, I think it's Papyrus Salier 1, where the Egyptians indict Apophis, the Hyksos king, as being his big sin was basically worshipping Baal above all the other gods. So he was a henotheist. So, so while the biblical text it doesn't mention it specifically, explicitly, there are allusions to it. There were allusions to it in the text. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. Okay. Question from Chao Yi. He asks, have you ever considered writing archaeological adventure fiction? No. But I have considered writing archaeological science fiction. I'm a big science fiction fan, and I love reading science fiction. And I have written fiction. And I'm getting to the point where I'm almost good at it. One of the things is, for example, author Jane Aul, who wrote The Mammoth Hunters. She said once that you have to write 1,000,000 words to get the garbage out of your system. And only after you write 1,000,000 words, only then do you start to write good stuff. Well, I'm at that point where I've written about 1,000,000 words of really, really terrible science fiction that I'm starting to actually write some good stuff. So, it had occurred to me that I do have an interest in writing fiction. And particularly science fiction, I do love it. So I have considered doing archaeological science fiction. Now, with that said, time is the big enemy. Writing fiction takes a lot of time. Writing anything takes a lot of time. I have done a novel start on an archaeological science fiction. I have not yet completed it, and I have not scheduled it into my rather onerous schedule right now to complete it. I should probably, but I haven't done it. So, yes, I've thought about it. I've deeply considered it. I have taken steps towards it. Just not adventure fiction, science fiction. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Okay, we got another super chat from John Fabeck for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. How much do we know about the Philistines from archaeology? Do we have any texts from them about the biblical events from their point of view? We don't have any text from the Philistines. Okay. Not sure. Some of their cities have been excavated or partially excavated, like Ekron, Gaza has been excavated. Ashkelon has been parts of Ashkelon have been excavated. We do know some things about the Philistines. We do know that, like for example, the silver calf the famous silver calf comes from Ashkelon. We do know some things about the Philistines. We do have pictures of sea peoples from, say, the temple at Medina Habu. We don't have a lot of perspectives, though, from their point of view. So we don't have much in the way of written texts. We have some small seals from the Philistines, but really not very much. It's very slight what we have from the Philistines. Part of the problem with doing Philistine archaeology is on that coastal plain, the water table is very high. Very, very high in that water table. So anytime you deal with a archaeology with a high water table, you're not digging in sand, you're digging in mud. And that's difficult archaeology. That's difficult archaeology to do. It's why I didn't do a lot of Israelite archaeology, is because I like digging in sand. It's dry. You feel clean. You don't feel clean after you dig in mud. It's not a pleasant experience, and you don't find much. So yeah, I don't think that there's a lot of we do find a few Philistine burials, not very many. There just isn't a lot of material that survived the Philistine cities. We do find their cities. We do find their occupation zones. We do know, like, for example, they used casemate walls. So we do know some stuff about the Philistines. We do know they were Indo-Europeans, but we don't know much about their perspectives or their points of view. So, unfortunately, we only have one side to the biblical events between, in the agricultural war of the Shephelah, for example. So, or say their conflict with Samson. So we have very, very little. We only have one side of this, unfortunately. So, until we get more texts, particularly more texts that relate to biblical events, it's going to be hard to say much more about the Philistines as far as their perspective goes on these events. So anyway, but as I said, we know things about them. We just don't have a complete picture. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It's a good question. Unfortunately, we don't have more. Ooh! Sumatos Patui! Is it a sin to mix sodas at a restaurant soft drink fountain? Mixing odd kinds, huh? You're mixing your Coca-Cola with Hawaiian Punch again, aren't you? It may be a sin of bad taste, but I don't think it's against the kosher laws. Probably is. Well, I mean, it's of like kind, though. Soda with soda? Yeah, it's like kind. It would be outside of kosher laws anyway because it's non-organic. All artificial flavors for the most part. As long as you do it with chemicals, it's fine. As long as you do it with plant-based stuff, it's fine. Just don't mix it with the milk, okay? Leave the pineapple pina colada stuff alone, and you'll be okay. But you'll only find that in Mexican restaurants, where they'll have the pina colada soda dispenser. Yes. And definitely, just leave your gelatos alone. Okay. Don't mix the soda with the ice cream soft serve dispenser either. Very, very humorous question. Thank you for the question. Okay, I'll take this one from Slim2K. He goes, why do you think the pyramids don't have hieroglyphs inside them, but the Valley of the King's Tombs do? Is there hieroglyphs that depict pyramids? Yes, there is. Someone said no, and it proves that they predate Egypt. Okay. This is actually not quite so black or white for a couple reasons. First of all, some pyramids had hieroglyphs in them. Okay? For example, we do find, say, in the pyramids of Dynasty 6, Pyramid of Unas, Pyramid of Teti we do find pyramid hieroglyphs in both those pyramids. Hieroglyphs in the form of the pyramid texts. This is where the pyramid texts come from. Is these are carved inscriptions inside the pyramid. Now, the question then is, why did earlier pyramids before Dynasty 6, not have hieroglyphs in them? And the question does seem to boil down to is, what were the funerary temples like? Technically, Unas is the end of Dynasty 5, but he's the last member of Dynasty 5. So, with that said, however, it's really not until Dynasty 6 that we see hieroglyphs in full. So, technically, yes, Dynasty 5, at the end of Dynasty 5, we see hieroglyphs. So, why did the predecessors before Unas not have hieroglyphs in the pyramids? What it seems to boil down to is that the hieroglyphs were not in the pyramids. They were actually in the funerary temples. That's where we find the hieroglyphs, is in the funerary temples. Now, you go around, say, the mastabas that surround these pyramids, like, for example, around, say, let's take, for example, the pyramid of Khufu, the biggest pyramid in Egypt. Okay, you know, he's Dynasty 4, biggest pyramid. There's no hieroglyphs inside the pyramid itself, except for one piece of writing in the king's chamber. The name Khufu is written in the king's chamber. Now, we don't know if that's contemporary with Khufu himself, but pretty good odds it is. Okay? So, but you look at all the tombs around the Great Pyramid, the mastabas, the tombs of the dignitaries, the ones that are all contemporary with Khufu. We have to remember that a pyramid forms the center of a royal necropolis. So you have the king buried in his pyramid, but around it is a whole bunch of other tombs. And those other tombs are the king's functionaries. They're his administrators. They're his viziers. They're his princes and sons and daughters. They're his wives. So all these other people are being buried around the pyramid. And inside those tombs is a ton of writing. You look at, say, the mastabas that date to King Khufu. Tons of writing. We don't need any writing in the pyramid itself to figure out who the pyramid belongs to. All we have to do is look at who was buried around it. Because they'll say, I was the seal bearer of Khufu. I was vizier of Khufu. I was the accountant of Khufu. I was a priest under the reign of Khufu. You know, it gets monotonous, you know, and really, I mean, it's pretty monolithic. I mean, as I said, if no pyramid had any writing at all, you can figure out the owner of each pyramid just by who's buried around it. Easily. I mean, it is no doubt. Because everyone wants to be close to the king. In this life and the next. So, the fact that it has no writing proves nothing. That's an absence of evidence argument. And absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Basically, all the tombs around a pyramid without hieroglyphs would tell you who that pyramid belonged to. Easily. Okay? The fact is, they wouldn't be building for a particular reign. I mean, and frankly, all those tombs are for a particular reign. You know, it's not like you've got, say, somebody buried around Khufu's pyramid, and then, say, you know, somebody from Unis's time burying himself right beside Khufu's pyramid. It didn't happen that way. Someone from Unis's time would be burying himself beside Unis's pyramid. Because he's the king. He's the guy you want to get close to. Not some king that lived 200 years earlier. Okay? So, and basically, then in the afterlife, you still serve your king. So, because that's what you did in this life. Now, we do, as I said, we do find pyramids that do have writing in them. Unis, Teti are just two examples of those. And, but we also find, for example, that writing was in, say, pyramids, say the, what's called down, the temples, like the river temples, the mortuary temples. That's where you would have also have found a lot of that writing. So, these temples would have been decorated with very, very elaborate stone. They would have been there for people to see, read about the king's accomplishments. So, you know, again, it's not that those pyramids there was no writing connected with the pyramid itself. It's that they shifted it. They didn't put it in the pyramid. They put it in the temple. And it's in the temple where they would have been. Now, the unfortunate thing is that a lot of those mortuary temples did not survive. And you look at, say, the funerary temple of Menkaure. We know from, say, the archaeology of the area that temple was in operation for 200 years after that temple, after that king died. But we also know, too, that the writing on it has been completely eaten away because of wind erosion. I mean, it's just like those stones look like pieces of moon rock. I mean, they've got gouges in them that are like 3-4 feet deep. I mean, just incredible gouges caused by wind erosion. So, unfortunately, a lot of that writing has been just sheared off by just passage of time and wind and sand. So anyway, we know how to date these pyramids. There's no question when they date to. There's no question who they belong to. Even without writing on the inside, it's a no-brainer. It really is a no-brainer. When you've got 100 tombs, 1,000 tombs around a pyramid, and they all point to the same king, yeah, you can figure it out pretty easy. So anyway, thank you for the question. It's a good question, but it again is very easy to figure out which king, who owns what pyramid in general. Now, there's some small pyramids we don't know. Okay, but we would have also presumed that, say, a small pyramid would not have belonged to a king, but to a queen. So we have to take that in mind too. Well, anyway, thank you very much for a question. Very much appreciate it. Okay, Crisero Benny, he says, the chronology of the Septuagint is very different from the Masoretic text in many cases. And I agree, it's probably the superior, I think the Masoretic, the Septuagint is the superior chronology in the case of, say, Genesis 5 and 11. For example, 430 versus 215 years in Egypt. What do you think of these differences? Now, like, for example, the 413 versus 215. Now, in the case of their time in Egypt, it doesn't explicitly say 215. Okay? What it does is it sort of splits the difference. So it says 400 30 years in Canaan and Egypt. And from back tracing the genealogy, it's a minimum 215 years, but not a maximum. The maximum for the Septuagint that they spent in Egypt was 350 years. So 215 is a minimum, and that's based upon calculations, not from the text explicitly. But I do think, like, for example, the numbers in the Septuagint's Genesis 11 and 5 are better. Okay, I think they're more consistent with the original texts. Now, with that said, however, I think there's some people, like, I think it's Nate 4D or something like that, who basically says that that the Septuagint allows creationism because it dates the flood to before the pyramids. Okay, essentially adding on an extra roughly 1,000 years, I think, or 800 years. So it happens just before the first pyramids of Egypt. Okay. The problem with that is it makes it easier, but it doesn't solve the problem. The problem comes in is that while the dates for the Septuagint don't run afoul of, say, like, for example, with the Masoretic text, if you do a wooden reading of the genealogies to try to do reverse dating, you get a date of the flood of 2350, which happens to be the same time as the pyramid at Giza is being built. Okay, so you add another 800 years to that, and you get something around, say, 3100 BC as the date of the flood. Well, now you're talking about the mastabas at Abydos are being built. Those still don't have flood damage. Not in the way that, say, a American young Earth creationist would want. So it sort of defers the problem, but doesn't fix the problem. I think that's the problem with that solution. So, while I think the Septuagint, on just a text-critical basis, as far as, say, Genesis 5 and 11, is a superior reading in most cases, maybe not all cases, because you have to take these numbers on a case-by-case basis. So you can't just say Genesis 5 better than Genesis, in Masoretic text is better than, say, Genesis 5 in the Septuagint. You have to take it by verse. And that would take a lot of work, actually, a lot of work to do that. But I also think, too, that, overall, in very broad brush, over general terms, the numbers in the Septuagint are usually better for that. As I said, though, that Exodus thing, that's a reverse calculation interpretation. So you'd have to be a bit cautious with that one. So, but I do think the reading from the Septuagint, that the 430 years in Canaan and Egypt, is the correct reading. It is the correct reading. We have it both in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and a lacuna found in, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls would also imply the same thing. So, I think the readings are, I think it's the best reading overall. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. I think we're getting really close to the end here, in which case we will call it a night. We have gone 3 hours, so that's plenty long enough. I think we are done. I'll take this last one. Okay. From Muslim Stalinist. This will be the last question of the night, unless someone slips in a 12th hour, 11th hour Super chat. This will be the last question of the night. Are there any texts of the Philistine deity Dagon and the folklore around him? I'm guessing he isn't an ancient Near East deity. He is a Philistine deity. He is a Philistine deity. And we do have a couple of iconographic examples of Dagon. And he's a wheat deity. He's actually a grain deity. So he's the deity of wheat. And that's basically about all we know about him. Is he's a wheat deity. He's a deity of grain. So we don't know much about Dagon. There was in the 19th century, people tried to do the etymology of Dagon, and they said, "Oh, Dagon, dag. That's the Hebrew word for fish. So he's a fish deity." Well, turns out he's not a fish deity. This is one of the problems with etymology. Sometimes it's a false etymology. Okay? It's a false etymology. So he's not a fish deity. Not a fish deity at all. Not even like the Anunnaki. He's not a fish deity in the slightest. He's a grain deity. Okay? And that's about all we know about him. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and that's going to be the last question for the night. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I want to thank our super chatters who help keep this channel going. You guys really, really help us, and so very much appreciate it. Without you guys, we wouldn't keep the lights on and keep this channel going. So we owe a lot to you super chatters. We really much appreciate it. And we answered a lot of non-super chats tonight, so we want to ask thank all of you who've done great questions that keep us engaged, that provide good material for us to respond to basically help inform the greater society that's going to be listening to this. And we want to thank all our subscribers. And last of all, I want to also thank all our Patreon supporters. Our Patreon supporters don't get enough thank yous. And really, really appreciate everything our Patreon supporters do, who do it oftentimes thanklessly. And, we wish we could do more for our Patreon supporters. And, we are there to listen to them and to respond to them anytime they want. So we are so appreciative to our Patreon supporters because they help us they basically pay for equipment when it breaks. And very much appreciated because they help keep the infrastructure of this channel going. So with that said, thank you very much for watching. I want to wish everyone a fantastic night. It was a great set of questions. And I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.